Okay, well, look, folks, you know I generally don't care how other countries conduct their business, especially if one of those countries is Canada. But I'm going to make an exception for today's threat assessment. We should pay close attention to what is going on in both Canada and France right now, for fear that actually, in those policies, they could actually come over here and lead to unrest and suppressing more creeping gradualism from our government through our borders faster than the Canadian geese do. Now, in Canada, we're seeing a classic example of government overreach. There is a proposed bill called C-18, which could essentially give Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the worst, the power to regulate the internet. He could suppress media entities which aren't lockstep with his political ideologies, just unilaterally. C-18 would force search engines like Google and Facebook to pay Canadian journalists for their right to link to their news articles, but only to journalists that Trudeau approves of course. In other words, conservative news outlets and distribution on social media platforms would be reduced to almost nothing. Interesting. Joining me now, former Georgia Congressman Doug Collins, host of the fantastic Doug Collins podcast. All right, Doug.
Hey, Carl.
I'm sitting there. I'm still recovering from the last segment, but you know what?
Me too.
Great conversation. I'm glad she came
Yes,
on.
I agree.
However, Canada, one of my least favorite places, they're going to say, you know what? We're going to wipe conservative and independent media off the map via finances. What do you make of this?
It's just, again, another attack, Carl. You do need to take this seriously, and I'm glad you brought this up. Is why should we care about France and Canada? Is because they're influencing the liberal social media around the world. This is something we need to pay attention to. Look, it's not just Canada. Kentucky just made a law that basically made free speech could be a felony, and this is Kentucky. Okay, We're not talking about California here. So this is important because it sets the stage. I've said this all along. If you want to see where a country's going, look the last 10 to 15 years, and you'll see where they're going because they have to build it, especially the liberal indoctrination builds slowly until they get to a point where they believe people have to have it, or they scare them into believing that this is the only way. We saw it then came in full blow with the pandemic. We've seen it in other things. What concerns me about Canada and specifically this kind of use of finances is we saw this with the truck drivers up there. Remember, they went after their financial well-being. They couldn't really stop them, so they went after their financial well-being. If you cut my finances off, you've cut me off. That's
true.
Why they're going for this.
And then when you went out in the streets and protested, they trampled you with horses.
Yes.
I want to get over to France, another place I don't take much salt from. But we've seen super violent protests in the recent days. And this is the murder of a teenager of African descent who tried to evade police officers, like resisting arrest, number one problem. Then they seemingly proposed it as a fairly harmless traffic stop. The accounts vary where maybe he tried to run over the officer, but the angle of the camera tells kind of two different stories. We've seen property damage, torching of cars, police stations. There's like 500 police officers who've been hospitalized with some injury because of this. $1 billion in damage. Now, I got to ask, Doug, this is obviously from a huge swath of migration that happened there that did not conform to France's cultural values, okay? Is this a threat? So we saw it with the Syrian refugees many, many years ago when this happened. Is this a threat that you can completely change a demographic by force and mob rule?
I think you're seeing it right in here. You're seeing it not only in France, but England as well. England has a large problem with this. And one of the things, Carl, and look, to be honest, in history, the first wave of immigrants to any country, the United States, will maintain their original identities. Okay, they're Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants. They maintain that. But by the second generation and third generation, you're typically finding them more amalgamated to the current situation that they have. We're not seeing that now. That's becoming more of a concern. I see young people who were either born here or they were brought over very young, who still maintain, from our southern border, Mexican ties, Honduras ties, Guatemalan flags. You see it a lot. Basically the amalgamation that makes us the melting pot of the world is not happening. France has never had it. For those who've traveled to Europe in the last few years, you've seen this getting worse and worse. But I have to warn you again, I'm going to bring another example from the United States. Just yesterday in Minnesota, Minneapolis, you saw Somali refugees shooting shooting fireworks down the street at I believe, officers and others. This is not that far off, folks. And the mainstream media cannot just continue to bury their head in the sand and think this is going to go away, because if it comes for them, whether it's finances, speech, or violence in the streets, it affects everyone.
Right, but the problem is, and this is Emmanuel Macron's problem from last week, he gave a speech talking about the protests. Listen to this.
Enfin, les plateformes et les réseaux sociaux jouent un rôle considérable dans les mouvements des derniers jours. Nous avons vu sur plusieurs d'entre elles, Snapchat, TikTok et plusieurs autres, à la fois l'organisation de rassemblements violents se faire, mais une forme de mimétisme de la violence.
So essentially, Doug, what he's doing is he's scapegoating how this happened and blaming it on social media companies for, letting people converse openly. But look, at some point, doesn't he have to take the reins and say, hey, yeah, I allowed this to happen, under the last few years of my government. Shouldn't I be accountable?
He needs to, and all leaders need to. I mean, it's easy to point to social media companies, especially now. What was it? The old Rahm Emanuel, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yep.
And this is exactly what's happening now. We'll blame it on the social media company. Nobody likes them anyway, so let's just blame it on them. However, you can't also take it when you're taking in these migrants, you're putting them in shelters, you're putting them in second-class citizen treatment, you're seeing this, handouts, where they don't have any jobs, they're just sitting around. This is what, look, it's been said for years that the Middle East and Africa are just melting pots of concern because of this very issue here. There's nothing for them to do. There's no economic, we've got to build that out. But also, as you look at this, going forward, we've got to also make sure that they look at this from a perspective of saying, how do we do this? Because I remind liberals, boy, they sure did like TikTok when Hong Kong was having their Orange Rebellion. I think it was Orange, the umbrella. They liked it because it got everybody together. When they like it, but when it's against them, they'll use it against us.
Right, exactly. But the bigger problem here is, and this goes back to Trump's immigration policies. He was widely criticized for saying, look, I want a big, beautiful golden door in that wall, but we're going to put up that wall so we can control who enters and on what value system they do enter on. And people say, oh, that's racist. But at the same time, it's like, no. If you're not going to embrace the values of the country, and look, I don't, like I said, don't care much for the values of the French culture in what they believe in. However, it's their country. Shouldn't the people coming there who are getting the handouts be at least a little gratuitous towards that?
You would think so. But also, again, remember, we're seeing that here in the United States and in France. When you're not, again, it is amazing to me that Europe was pretty well stable on migrants until a few years ago when Merkel and others said, OK, just let them all come in. And they just sort of lowered the gates. The EU just said, if you're part of the EU, you've got to take as many as you can. Sweden, Sweden saw a very large influx of, they didn't know what to do with them. They were busing them for hours just to get them to some place to go. And again, what turned its compassion, what made them feel good ends up actually hurting them. And the creation is this. Before that migrant immigrant in Europe, they had very strict rules on who could stay, who could come, just as we did. But if you don't know who's coming in and out of your country, you really don't have control of your border. And that's not bigotry. That is just simple, careless, not being careless about who comes into your country.
I agree. The places like Sweden saw triple-digit increase in rape victims, and it was tragic. But Congressman Doug Collins, always a pleasure, sir. Appreciate you coming on.
Great to see you, Carl. Take care.
All right, straight ahead.